The brand new iPhone 13 and iPhone 13 Pro models bring a simulated shallow depth of field effect to video capture. They call it cinematic mode. I'd really like to use cinematic mode as part of my filmmaking toolbox, so here I'm trying to test it to see what its limitations are and what it can actually do. In this sample here, you can see that it is capable of simulating a very shallow depth of field, and it is pretty good at tracking objects in the scene. This particular scene was a bit of a nightmare. As you can see, it was trying to resolve the bird properly, but struggling to capture the edges correctly and therefore blurring the bird in many cases. However, there are some scenes where it did a fantastic job, as you'll see in this scene coming up. Now, the auto tracking of the cinematic mode was pretty good, but in order to get it so precise as you see here, I had to go in and manually add points. You can see those points on the timeline appearing on the bottom of the screen there, and you can see my manual tracking points that really helped. Again, another example where it did pretty well, apart from the bird's head, which it struggled with the beak specifically, and was often blurred. So in this scene, obviously an artificial setup here, I just wanted to see how the cinematic mode would deal with gaps in objects, as we know that the portrait mode historically has struggled with this. As you can see, it really does try quite hard, especially there in the rhino's legs there, but it definitely gets it wrong. Now I'm hoping that this is something that can be fixed. However, in this example, we do see it deal really well with these kind of inclusions, these gaps within objects. There are some errors, but not as many as you would expect. In this scene, I think the iPhone cinematic mode does a fantastic job of blurring both the foreground and the background accurately. Here we see a rack focus, where we go from the foreground to the background gradually, and here I demonstrate how it's done just by selecting those points manually and changing the focal plane back towards the back of the scene. I'm calling this the seagull challenge. Can cinematic mode clearly define the edges of a seagull, and including the gap between the legs? Well, unfortunately the answer is no at the moment. In this particular scene, it really does struggle. But I'm sure Apple can get to grips with this, just as they did with portrait mode for still photography. Interestingly, in this particular scene, we see the cinematic mode does correctly identify the gap between the legs. It does struggle a little bit though with the beak, I guess because there's a little bit less contrast between the colour of the beak and the background. I don't know for sure, but it will be interesting to follow the progress of cinematic mode to see how it improves. In this small scene, we see focus on the foreground and then slowly moving to focus on the boat moving through the scene, and it struggles a bit by blurring some of the buildings in the background, but overall not a bad little capture. Here does a perfect job. Foliage is blurred, the background is fine, and this is just a gorgeous scene which works so well with hardly any errors, I feel. All in all, a superb start for cinematic mode on the iPhone 13. I've got loads more testing to do with cinematic mode and other features of the iPhone 13, so please do remember to subscribe.